today we're going to be talking about and with Dr. Gerald Horne, who many of you know is a prolific author of more than 40 books, and is going to be visiting in DC on Saturday at Sankofa. Before we actually bring Dr. Horne on, we'll be bringing him on in a moment. We wanted to play Dr. GREG CARR, who many of you know, he's on many different platforms these days, but in his weekly In Class with CARR, he talked a lot about Gerald Horne's new books, and he also made some comments about what he called Hell Week. So we're going to hear two clips from GREG CARR. Let's go with the first one.
We can't be defeated. Those who think that this is a dark time should reflect, which is what we're going to do in part today, on what our ancestors did. Because one thing I love about being in Columbus, Georgia, is I was riding around last night and drove by my aunt Cara C, my mother's sister, and my Uncle Aaron's house, which I hadn't been on that street in nearly 50 years. Looked up at the sky, no street lights, and saw every star in the sky. You think we could be defeated? Last poet said, black is the color of the midnight sky. Black is so beautiful, it'll make you cry. I was there looking at these stars, looking at that porch, and across the street at an apartment complex where black men were encircled an oil drum with a fire that was twice the size of the drum coming out the drum and music playing in the middle of the night. And I thought to myself, you really think that somehow you're in control, Steve Bannon and Elon Musk? Oh, my friends. As Louis Farrakhan once sang in the 1950s, oh, my friends, it's easy to tell. White man heaven, black man hell. Yeah, well, if that's the case, is the inverse also the case? White man hell is a black man's heaven? Is white supremacy's hell African people's heaven? I think the answer to that, if we study history, is yes. The crisis in white supremacy, Gerald Horne talks about all the time, for decades. Actually wrote an article about it back in the late 90s, early arts in a journal called Socialism and Democracy. The name of the article is The Crisis in White Supremacy. And then a couple of years later, he published a little book called Blows Against the Empire.
And that was part of what GREG CARR, he spoke a lot on this last Saturday about Gerald Horne. We're going to hear another short clip about how GREG CARR summarizes Gerald Horne's latest book.
This book just came out. This is Gerald Horne's latest book. It just came out a couple of days ago. African Americans and a New History of the USA. This is Gerald Horne's latest book. And what's interesting about this book is it is not a new book. When you look at its 16 chapters, it is the introduction of 16 different books that are of the nearly 40 books that Gerald has written. These are the introduction chapters. And what he's doing is when you read them together, Chapter 1, the dawning of the apocalypse, the roots of slavery, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and capitalism in the long 16th century. Chapter 2, the apocalypse of settler colonialism, the roots of slavery, white supremacy, and capitalism in 17th century, North America and the Caribbean. So what he's doing in those first two chapters is erasing the idea that we should start any of our memory in 1619. Now, John Clark would start our memory in antiquity. Gerald is not against that, but his focus is on the last 500 to 600 years. And what he's not doing, what he's doing is revealing something that I've already said, but I'm going to tie it now to where we are as we kind of begin to think about this in context. What Gerald Horne is reminding us is that we should not think of ourselves as African people in relation to any of the criminal enterprises that came together to call themselves Europe. Certainly not picking sides into which European we identify with the most. A 1619 project says, I identify with the English. A project that goes back to the 16th century say, I identify with the Spanish first, or I identify with the French first, because they precede the English, the Portuguese, or the Dutch. We identify with it. No. Gerald's like, don't identify with any of these people. All of this is visiting, as John Clark has said many times and written many times, the sores of Europe onto the world, which means even the people in Europe, the vast majority of people in Europe who had nothing to do with it, are being drawn into a criminal enterprise by a tiny group of people. Elon Musk has predecessors It's always been a handful of petty tyrants trying to run the world. The technology improved. That's the major difference. And the crisis of the 21st century will be the same as the crisis of the 16th century. Understand, white Christian nationalism is not new. At its beginning, it was called the Catholic Church. And the Portuguese and the Spanish fighting each other, internecine conflict, as John Clark used to say. And this is
Please cut that. Of course, that goes on and on and on. But we're happy to have that clip from Greg Carr, you can listen and check him out on In Class with Carr on YouTube each and every Saturday. But with that said, that's a great introduction, I think, to Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne, as we said before, a prolific author of more than 40 books. He's an African-American historian, currently is at the teaches at the John J. and Rebecca Moore's, where he's the chair of history and African-American studies at the University of Houston. He can be heard on many, many community radio shows, including right here on WPFW every Friday with Esther's on the Ground. He was on last week, and often is on Building Bridges Mondays at 7 p.m. with Mimi Rosenberg. But welcome, Gerald Horne, and let's start with making sure the listeners know if you can announce where you will be on Saturday.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, Saturday, February 1st, 6 to 8 p.m., Sankofa Books across the street from Howard University on Georgia Avenue.
Yes, and listeners are welcome to join us there. And Gerald will be talking about his two latest books. Perhaps you maybe start with summarizing those, but I want to make sure we also leave time for your comments on this first week we just went through with the Orange Man. But maybe, well, let's start with what the week we just went through, Dr. Horne. I don't know if you can summarize some of your top concerns about what we went through last week. I know it was a lot, but perhaps what are some of the things that really jumped out to you and is important for listeners to know from week one?
Withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, making more likely the kinds of wildfires that you saw in Los Angeles and are still seeing in Los Angeles to this very day. Withdrawing from the World Health Organization, making it more likely that the next pandemic will kill more than the 1.2 million that COVID-19 claimed in 2020, 2021 going forward. There is the attempt to further militarize the border with deportations taking place as we speak, leading to ruffled relations with Brazil and Colombia, which I don't have time to detail, but will have enormous consequence in terms of hemispheric relations. Also, perhaps most dangerously, is the pardoning of these criminals who sought to execute a fascist coup on January 6, 2021. They are already threatening retaliation and retribution and bid fair to create a kind of private militia acting at the beck and call of Mr. Trump. And of course, we have very unfortunate histories with private militias. Think back to the Ku Klux Klan post 1865. And then there's the overthrow of diversity, equity, and inclusion, including toppling the executive order by President Johnson in 1965, which formed a foundation for affirmative action. It's fair to suggest that the DC workforce is in the crosshairs. As I said in my book on DC, published a year or two ago, a long-term ambition of the right wing has been to move federal jobs outside of Washington. That will be proceeding apace, leaving workers with the unappetizing prospect of either moving, say, to Idaho or being unemployed. My understanding is that there's already a scuttlebutt about having a general strike of the workforce in Washington and the DMV on May 1st, 2025. And I trust and I hope that that is not an empty rumor.
Good point. You're listening to Dr. Gerald Horne. This is Joni with Two Heel DC, and Chuck is with me as well. We're going to be spending the rest of the hour, most of the rest of the hour, talking with Gerald Horne about his takeaways from this first week. Where do we go from here? And also reminding people about what the two books he's going to be talking about this Saturday at Sankofa. So, Dr. Horne, let's jump into the issue of what's happening with the immigrants, the whole situation with the immigrant communities, and perhaps mention a little bit about what happened in Newark and Ras Baraka's response, as well as in Chicago.
Well, there were a bevy of federal agents from various agencies that descended on Chicago in the last few days. And it's also important to note that a number invaded Newark, New Jersey, drawing the inflamed ire of Mayor Ras Baraka, the son of Amiri Baraka. Ras Baraka intends to mount a race for governor of the Garden State, and I dare say that his forthright militant response to the manhandling and roughhousing of his constituents will hold him in good stead for that gubernatorial race. I made reference a moment or two ago with regard to how the governments of both Bogota and Brasilia have objected strenuously to the disrespect accorded to their nationals. As a matter of fact, President Petro of Colombia refused landing rights to this plane that was bringing Colombian nationals back to their homeland. And in fact, he reminded one and all that there are about 15,000 US nationals in Colombia who don't have regularized immigration papers. And he recommended that they show up at the relevant agencies to correct that error. The same thing happened with regard to Brazil. And of course, Brazil is a giant of the continent, a standing member of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is seeking to supplant the G7 led by the United States of America. When I think they have a very good chance of doing so, from the fact that Mr. Trump is alienating so-called allies as he goes after would-be allies in the hemisphere. And indeed, I noticed as well that the President Castro has also been objecting to how her nationals have been treated in the United States of America. And in fact, there's supposed to be a major meeting this week that will involve President Petro, who will be coming to Tegucigalpa, and they are mounting a defense against this sort of lancing that they're being subjected to. Interestingly enough, President Petro suggested that he would send his presidential plane to the United States to transport Colombian nationals back to their homeland with dignity. I take it that that will take place after this meeting in Honduras.
And this is a difficult question, I think, for many of us, but as we face so many challenges now, to say the least, one concern that I've been having in the past few days is the issue of the immigrants, undocumented immigrants in this community, as well as around the country. I've been hearing from teachers, for example, particularly in Montgomery County, sharing the fact that young children are coming to them very scared and asking the teachers, what can they do? So we do have organizations such as Casa de Maryland, but I must say we are to a great extent very separated from each other. There's not enough real solidarity among some of the key activist organizations, which is understandable. There's a lot going on. But I don't know, Dr. Horne, if you have any suggestions or advice or concerns of your own, particularly on this issue of the undocumented immigrants, and how do we, in the progressive community and the activist community, support each other?
Well, first of all, we expect our friends in Washington, D.C. to play a vanguard role during the next few years because you are not only in the belly of the beast, you're in the esophagus of the beast. You have a critical role to play. And indeed, with regard to WPFW, you know that I've recommended that you start a new program called Fascism Watch that will be a kind of clearinghouse of information connecting organizations across boundaries and borders, particularly, I would argue, reporting on the doings of these miscreants who have just been pardoned by Mr. Trump and their ongoing attempts to revive the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers is quite ominous and quite dangerous. Certainly, being in Washington, D.C., the headquarters of the Organization of American States, which means that there are delegates, there are representatives from the southern neighbors of the United States of America, not to mention a Cuban interest section. And of course, Cuba is going to be in the forefront of seeking to rally the hemisphere, not least because it's just been co-opted to the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They have an ambitious plan to convert the port of Mariel into a major hub for trade with the BRICS nations. And of course, Cuba has a material interest in weakening Trumpism, just as the audience of WPFW has a similar purpose, I would hope and imagine.
Absolutely. And Dr. Horne, you've also raised concerns about, rightly so, about federal workers right here in Washington, D.C. that are most likely going to be hit hard. And the importance of us, standing up in solidarity with this workforce.
Oh, sure. And there's an article in the New York Times on the front page this morning going into the fears and anxieties of many of the laborers in federal offices in Washington, D.C. They feel under siege. Of course, Mr. Trump has suggested that those who violate his edict with regard to overthrowing diversity, equity, and inclusion, that those who seek to pursue those policies be snitched on by internal spies, and who knows what fate will await once the snitching takes place. And so I think that is well past time, and I'm sure that's happening as we speak, that the union step up for the members who are now under siege, because it's apparent that Mr. Trump sees a major stumbling block in terms of executing his diabolical and devilish plans. He sees a major stumbling block being the unions, particularly the federal workers in the District, Maryland, and Virginia.
Absolutely. And I think during this first week, we saw one national union step up, NTEU, a National Treasury Employees Union, who filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration just on Monday evening, I believe, challenging the right of the administration to actually turn people, as you said, into snitching against each other. So we'll be watching that as we move along, and hopefully we'll be hearing from other unions that are stepping up to the plate. I think we want to make sure we leave time, Dr. Horne, for you to talk about your two books. We did hear about your latest book, and maybe you could repeat the name, but let's also talk about your other new book, which is really quite a phenomenal book. So tell us the titles of each book, and then talk about the one that we haven't heard about yet this morning, that gives the history of the Black Panthers, etc.
To reiterate the kind and gracious words of Professor GREG CARR of Howard University. One book is African Americans in a New History of the United States of America. It constitutes, as he said, about 16 introductions to various books that I've published over the years, stretching from the 1500s up to the present, actually before the 1500s, because as I tell the story, you can't understand race as it is constructed in the Americas without understanding religion, which means some understanding of Christianity in the first place and conflicts between Christians and Muslims and Christians and the Jewish community, and then internal conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, which I argue is critical to understanding the rise of race and how race supplants religion as a marker in society. And I trace that through the first few centuries of settler colonialism. And speaking of settler colonialism, I put forward an idea that I think is still relevant today, which is that settler colonialism was based upon class collaboration between and amongst Europeans of various class backgrounds who were bent upon expropriating the indigenous and then enslaving the Africans. And class collaboration is the key to understanding the 77 million who voted for Mr. Trump on November 5th, 2024. And it's astonishing and astounding to me that many of our friends on the left do not have the term class collaboration within their ordinary vocabulary. Instead, they're trying to throw dust in our eyes by suggesting that the 77 million are actually frustrated social democrats who want to vote for a social democratic program. Of course, that doesn't explain the rather paltry totals for Cornel West, Jill Stein, and Claudia de la Cruz. In any case, I trace the history of the United States through the prism of the African-American struggle up into the 21st century. Now, the other book that you referenced is entitled Armed Struggle, ? Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. This is a book that deals with the Southland, the leading city being Los Angeles and the leading state being California, the militancy that has characterized that particular region, particularly with the rise of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s and the hammer that fell down on them subsequently. And once again, one of the arguments that I make involves class collaboration, because despite the yeoman duty conducted by the Panthers, not to mention the communists, I think that there was an inadequate analysis of settler colonialism. There was an inadequate analysis of class collaboration, and that led to rather profound and serious errors.
So explain a little bit more what you mean by that, particularly in terms of class collaboration not being focused on enough.
Well, I think that oftentimes, believe it or not, there has been a kind of assumption that the United States, for example, is not unlike France. France had this revolution circa 1789. The United States had a so-called revolution around the same time, except the French Revolution contributed mightily to the abolition of slavery circa 1793, whereas in the United States, 1776, you had thousands of enslaved Africans. By 1861, on the verge of the US Civil War, you had millions. And so this question of settler colonialism sweeping across the continent, liquidating Native Americans, is a very peculiar and unique experience that implicated many working class settlers. In fact, you had many programs that were designed to uplift them and exclude others. I'm thinking of the Homestead Act of the 1860s, for example, whereby purloined land for the Native Americans was turned over to settlers, sometimes fresh off the boat, and then so-called land-grant universities were constructed on that same land, whereby the settlers and their sons and daughters could receive higher education, climb the class ladder, and those of us not inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness were generally excluded. But instead of focusing on those salient factors, there has been this assumption that class unity prevails even in the face of realities that point in an opposing direction. And I think that led the Panthers to make an incorrect analysis of the correlation of forces domestically, causing them to believe that they could conduct armed struggle against the U.S. imperialist machine, and that presumably they could gain support from these voters who were then subsequently voting for George Wallace and other segregationists, or voting for Richard Nixon, or voting for LBJ for that matter. So this is part of what this book concerns, and this is part of what I'll be discussing on Saturday, February 1st, 6 to 8 at Sankofa.
Yes, great. And Gerald, if you can, this may be not an easy question, but what advice might you have for activists in particular, or all people listening now? But let's speak to the, as you say, our friends on the left and all people out there that are going to be trying to stand up against the threats we will be facing. Any lessons from history, whether it be recent history or going back to the McCarthy period or before? Please share your words of wisdom.
Well, first of all, internationalism. That's a theme of both of these new books. That is to say, you cannot understand how we, speaking of people of African descent, were able to escape the ravages of slavery, then Jim Crow, without understanding international solidarity, solidarity with the Haitian Revolution, solidarity with British abolitionists, solidarity with President Vicente Guerrero of Mexico in the 1820s, a president of African descent who abolished slavery, and then that led to the secession of Texas, or Tejas, from Mexico, joining the United States of America by 1845. So in Washington, as noted, you are cheek by jowl with the Organization of American States. The city is festooned with embassies and legations from virtually every nation on planet Earth. You have a responsibility, it seems to me, to be in the vanguard of our struggle and in the vanguard of internationalism. And then, second of all, a theme of this book, African Americans in the New History of the United States, I think is important to having an analysis of where we are right now. That is to say, as noted, not only do I posit that settler colonialism involves class collaboration, I also posit that the unpaid sector of the working class, speaking of enslaved Africans, were determined to engage in class struggle. And unless you understand that fundamental contradiction between class struggle on the one hand and class collaboration on the other, you will be doomed to failure. But I am certain that we are not doomed to failure. I am certain that our comrades and friends in Washington, D.C. will step up to the plate, to use your metaphor, and that gives me hope for the near term.
Well, thank you very much, Gerald Horne, and you give me hope, and I'm sure you give a lot of the rest of the listeners hope as well. Again, Dr. Gerald Horne can be heard mostly every Friday, and certainly this Friday with Esther Averum at 10 a.m. on the ground. And you can come out and meet Gerald Horne at Sankofa this Saturday from 6 to 8 p.m. Thank you very much, Gerald Horne, and we'll see you on Saturday.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.